So hello everyone, I am Arpajyoti Vashak, a final year MBBS student from IPGMI and SSKM College, and today our topic of discussion is Tetralogy of Fallot. So, as it is evident from the topic tetra, which means 4. So there has to be 4 defects, and since this is the condition of the heart, there are going to be 4 cardiac defects of the heart. So to have an understanding of what these cardiac defects are, you have to have an understanding of the embryology of the heart. Let us suppose you develop a crush on someone. You do not go and directly approach him on her. You find out the Insta ID or the Facebook ID, or you inquire about them from the friends, and then you think of approaching him or her. Similar is the case in here. To understand these 4 cardiac defects, the absolute knowledge of the embryology is very essential. And if you do not understand, you don't know how to understand the cardiac defects. So, now let's discuss the embryology of the heart. Suppose this is the primitive heart tube. And now I will be labeling the structures from proximally to distally. So the proximal most part is the sinus venosus, which has its body and right and left horn, the entire atria, the ventricle, and the distal most part, the bulbous cordis. This bulbous cordis is further subdivided into 3 parts which are equally so. All the 3 parts are 1/3 of the bulbous cordis. So the proximal most part is the primitive ventricle, in the middle is the conus, and then the distal most part is the truncus arteriosus. So now when this structure is developed, there is some changes in this. During development, the sinus venosus, the body, and the left horn they regresses spontaneously, and the right horn forms the superior and the inferior vena cava. The atria forms the left and the right atrium. And the ventricle forms the left ventricle, and the primitive ventricle forms the right ventricle. And the conus forms the outflow tract of the left and the right ventricle. And the truncus arteriosus, they form 2 structures. First, pulmonary trunk, and second, ascending aorta. So when this structure is developed, let us suppose that this is the primitive heart tube. So when this structure folds upon itself, it will somewhat look like this. And if we see it from another aspect and another view, this will somewhat look like this. So we are going to draw a pictorial representation of this. So after this structure is folded, this is somewhat going to be like this. Where this part is the atria and this part is the ventricle. So now when we have this knowledge of all the structures developed from the primitive heart tube, let us have an understanding of the septums formed in the primitive heart tube. So the first septum that is formed is the spiral septum in the truncal arteriosus part, and this is also known as the truncus septum as it is developed in the truncus arteriosus. So the first septum is truncus arteriosus, truncal septum, or the spiral septum, which arises from two swellings located in the right superior quadrant and the left inferior quadrant. And this is known as the spiral septum because of the spiralization of the structures of the septum. And as a result, there is a lot of confusion of the arrangement of the structures at several places of the spiral septum. And the structures are, we know, primitive pulmonary trunk and ascending aorta. So, I have made a prop which somewhat looks like a spiral septum and it has all the arrangement of the structures. So, for example, consider the blue one as the pulmonary trunk and the red one as ascending aorta. So, as you can see at the proximal most part, the pulmonary trunk lies anteriorly towards the front and the ascending aorta lies posteriorly towards the back. At the middlemost part, the pulmonary trunk is towards the what side? What side it is? Towards the left, and the ascending aorta is towards the right. And at the distalmost part, the pulmonary trunk becomes posteriorly and the ascending aorta becomes anteriorly due to the spiralization of the septum. So, when we have the truncal septum, now the second septum develops, that is the conal septum. So, the first one was truncal septum, the second one is conal septum. So, now there is development of the third septum, the interventricular septum, which has three parts. The first part is from the smooth muscle of the bulboventricular cavity. So let us suppose this is the muscular part of the interventricular septum. So now we can see that there is a huge gap between the conal septum, and this conal septum is also known as the bulbar septum. There is a huge gap between the conal septum or the bulbar septum and the muscular part of the interventricular septum. So to fill this gap, here is the endocardial cushion, which is also known as the AV cushion, as it lies at the junction of the atria and the ventricle, and there is anterior proliferation of this endocardial cushion such that it fills the gap between these two parts. And so the first part of the interventricular septum is the muscular part, then the membranous part, and lastly a small part of the conal septum or the bulbar septum. So all these structures form the three septums: the first truncal septum or the spiral septum, then the conal septum or the bulbar septum, and lastly the interventricular septum. So now when we have that knowledge or understanding of the embryology of the heart, let us understand what those four cardiac defects were. Suppose this is the heart. This is the interventricular septum. This is the pulmonary trunk. And this is the ascending aorta. So, the defect in tetralogy of Fallot is there is anterior shifting of the conotruncal septum, that is, first the truncal septum and the conal septum. They both shift anteriorly. So, when they shift anteriorly, for example, suppose this was the structure earlier at the proximal most part of the spiral septum, this being the pulmonary trunk anteriorly and the ascending aorta posteriorly. So when it shifts anteriorly, the pulmonary trunk, the space where the pulmonary trunk is, it becomes narrowed. And this is something called pulmonary stenosis, which occurs at the infundibulum of the right ventricular, and so this is also known as infundibular stenosis. And the ascending aorta, the space becomes enlarged. If we see this in this diagram, you can find that there will be a narrowing of the pulmonary trunk. Earlier it was this, and now it has become like this. So there is narrowing of pulmonary stenosis, and the ascending aorta becomes enlarged, so much so that both the left ventricle and the right ventricle, they both drain into the ascending aorta, and this is called overriding of aorta. So now to eject the blood through the narrowed opening, we need more force, and for more force, more muscles are required, and hence there has to be hypertrophy of the muscles, and so there is right ventricular hypertrophy. So we have an understanding of the three cardiac defects. One is left. So truncal septum did all these three. I also mentioned that there is anterior shifting of the conal septum and the bulbous septum as well. So when this septum shifts anteriorly, there is going to be a gap created between the conal septum and the membranous part of the interventricular septum, and so this results in a ventricular septal defect, and there the blood is going to be shifted or shunted from right to left. Because there are right ventricular hypertrophy, so the more force, so the blood will be ejected from the right to the left, but in a normal condition generally the left ventricular muscles are more hypertrophied than right. But here, as you know that there is right ventricular hypertrophy, so the pressure of the right ventricular is far more than the left ventricular, and hence there is a gap created or a pressure difference created, which results in right to left shunt. So now we know the four cardiac defects. The first, pulmonary stenosis; the second, overriding of aorta; the third, right ventricular hypertrophy; and the fourth, ventricular septal defect. First, second, third, and then the fourth. So these are the four cardiac defects of the tetralogy of the Fallot. We will discuss the clinical manifestations, treatment, and the diagnosis in the next class. Thank you.